If you hold British citizenship alongside another nationality, you could be denied boarding a flight, ferry, or train to the UK after February 25th, not because you've done anything wrong, not because your visa has expired, not because you're on any kind of watch list, but simply because you're traveling on your non-British passport. And here's what's making British citizens furious. The alternative to carrying a British passport is paying $589 for a certificate of entitlement, attached to your other passport per person. So a family of 4 dual nationals without valid British passports is looking at over $2,300 just to prove they have the right to enter their own country. The Home Office introduced these changes as part of a wider overhaul, requiring all travelers to have prior permission before coming to the UK, but the impact on dual nationals living abroad, particularly in Europe, has been devastating. Poorly communicated and in some cases legally complicated, in ways the government clearly didn't think through. I'm breaking down exactly what changed on February 25th, who's affected the £589 certificate that's causing outrage, the specific nightmare facing dual nationals in countries like Spain, and what British parents of children born abroad need to know urgently before those children are denied entry to Britain. I'm Cole Warren, and if you're a British citizen living abroad, or if you have family members who hold dual nationality, this rule change could affect your ability to travel home, not in some distant theoretical future, but right now, immediately from February 25th onwards. And the genuinely alarming part is how poorly this has been communicated to the people it directly affects. Hit that like button right now if you're a dual national, or if you know someone who is, because this information needs to reach every British citizen living abroad before they show up at an airport and get denied boarding to their own country. Right, let's start with exactly what the new rule is and why it exists. The UK government has been rolling out a system requiring all travelers to have prior permission before arriving in Britain. For visitors from countries that previously had visa-free access, this means applying for an electronic travel authorization, the ETA, which costs $60 and links digitally to your passport before you travel. The logic behind this system is that airlines, ferry companies, and train operators like Eurostar now have to check that every passenger has permission to enter the UK. Before they board, if a passenger doesn't have verified permission, the carrier is responsible, they'll be fined. So carriers are being extremely strict about checking documentation before anyone gets on board. For most travelers, this is straightforward. You have a visa or you have an ETA and you're cleared to board. But here's where dual British nationals fall into a genuinely complicated gap in the system. British citizens cannot apply for an ETA because they don't need one. British citizens have an automatic right to enter the UK, but that right is attached to their British citizenship, not to whatever passport they happen to be carrying. Previously, this wasn't a problem if you were a British, French dual national traveling to the UK on your French passport. You'd arrive at UK border control. The officer would check their systems, identify your British citizenship, and wave you through. The verification happened at the UK border, after you'd already boarded and traveled. But now the verification happens before boarding. The carrier checks your documentation and must confirm you have permission to travel. If you're presenting a French passport and you haven't got an ETA linked to that passport, the carrier sees no evidence of travel permission and legally cannot let you board. The problem is, British citizens can't get an ETA for their non-British passport. The ETA system is specifically for people who don't have the right to live in the UK. British citizens have that right automatically, but only if they can prove their British citizenship at the point of boarding. And if you're not carrying your British passport, you can't prove it to the airline at check-in. Now here's where it gets financially devastating. The Home Office has provided an alternative for dual nationals who don't have a valid British passport. A certificate of entitlement. This is an official document that confirms your right of abode in the UK and can be attached to your non-British passport. It proves to carriers that despite not carrying a British passport, you have the legal right to enter the UK. The certificate of entitlement costs $589 per person per application, and before you ask, no, it's not a quick online process. It requires a full application with supporting documentation, proving your British citizenship. Processing takes time and it needs to be renewed. If you renew your non-British passport, for an individual dual national, $589 is a significant sum to pay, simply to exercise a right you already legally have. But for families, the cost becomes genuinely prohibitive. 2 parents and 2 children without valid British passports. That's $2,356 just in certificate fees. And that's before you've even bought plane tickets. British citizens living abroad who've been affected by this change have been furious, and rightly so. Many had no idea this rule was coming. The Home Office's communication about how the new ETA system affects dual nationals was, by widespread accounts, inadequate. People discovered the change when they tried to check in online and couldn't complete the process, or when they were questioned at the airport about their travel documentation. Now, before I explain the specific and extremely serious complication this creates for dual nationals in certain European countries, this is critical. Subscribe to this channel right now and turn on notifications, because border rules and documentation requirements are changing rapidly, and if you or anyone you know travels to the UK regularly, you need to stay informed. Drop a comment too. Are you a dual national affected by this change? Or do you know someone who's been denied boarding because of it? Right, let's talk about the Spain situation, because this is genuinely one of the most complicated and troubling aspects of this entire rule change, and it's affecting thousands of British citizens living in one of the most popular destinations for UK expats. In Spain, the path to citizenship traditionally required applicants to renounce their previous nationality. So thousands of British citizens who've lived in Spain for decades, who've built lives there, who've gone through the Spanish naturalization process, many of them formally renounced their British citizenship as part of becoming Spanish citizens. But here's the legal complexity. British nationality law doesn't always recognize that renunciation. If it happened in certain circumstances, some of these individuals may technically still hold British citizenship under UK law, even though they formally renounced it under Spanish law, and some became Spanish citizens after Brexit, specifically to maintain their EU rights, but the exact status of their British citizenship is legally complicated. But even for those who genuinely hold both nationalities, without ambiguity, there's a serious practical problem. If they travel to the UK carrying their British passport, which is what the new rules require, Spanish authorities could theoretically question whether they're violating the terms of their Spanish citizenship, which was granted on the basis of renouncing previous nationalities. Most Spain-based British nationals with dual status have operated for years by traveling on their Spanish EU passport for movement within Europe and their British passport for travel to the UK. The new UK rules are now creating a situation where doing what the UK government requires could potentially create legal complications in Spain. That's an extraordinary position for the UK government to have put its own citizens in. And there's another group being badly affected that isn't getting nearly enough attention: children born abroad to British parents who have never held a British passport. This is more common than you might think. British citizens living abroad sometimes don't immediately register their children's British nationality or apply for British passports, particularly if the family has no immediate plans to travel to the UK. These children are technically British citizens by descent. They have every legal right to enter the UK, but under the new system, if they don't have a valid British passport, there's no straightforward way for them to demonstrate that right to a carrier before boarding. They can't get an ETA because British citizens aren't eligible. And a certificate of entitlement requires proof of British citizenship. That might take time to gather. If the family hasn't previously gone through the formal registration process, the practical result is that some children, who are British citizens and have every right to visit the UK, could face being denied boarding on a technicality because the documentation system hasn't been designed to handle the full complexity of British nationality law. Now, let's be clear about what British citizens should do. If they're in any of these situations, if you're a dual national who travels to the UK regularly, the cleanest solution is to have a valid British passport and use it when traveling to the UK, the British passport application process. While not instant is straightforward for British citizens, and having that document eliminates the problem entirely, if you've let your British passport expire, which many dual nationals did, because they were traveling primarily on their other passport, you need to renew it urgently. British passport renewal typically takes several weeks, so if you're planning travel to the UK in the coming months and your passport has expired, start the renewal process immediately. If you're in a country like Spain where passport complications exist, you should take legal advice on your specific situation before traveling. The interaction between British and Spanish nationality law is complex enough that a general rule of thumb won't cover every individual case. If you have children who are British citizens but don't have British passports, the priority is applying for those passports now. The British citizenship registration process for children born abroad can take time, and then the passport application adds more time on top. Don't wait until you have travel booked to start this process. If you're in a situation where the £589 certificate of entitlement is genuinely the only option available to you in the short term, be aware that the application process requires specific documents, proving your right of abode. Gather those documents in advance and submit the application as early as possible, before any planned travel. Now stepping back from the practical advice, let's acknowledge the broader frustration here. The UK government is rolling out the most significant overhaul of its border control system in decades, a system that requires prior permission for essentially all travelers. That overhaul has policy logic behind it. It's about border security, immigration management, and modernizing how entry to the UK is verified. But policy logic doesn't excuse poor communication and inadequate preparation for the people affected. Dual British nationals living abroad should have received clear, proactive communication explaining exactly how the new system affects them, what their options are, and how to ensure they can continue traveling to the UK without disruption. That communication clearly didn't happen adequately, and British citizens are now dealing with the consequences of that failure. The £589 certificate fee in particular represents a significant financial barrier for British citizens to exercise rights they already have. There's a strong argument that the government should have provided a more accessible and affordable route for dual nationals to demonstrate their British citizenship to carriers, rather than essentially forcing them to either maintain two valid passports at all times or pay substantial fees. Several MPs and campaigners have already raised these concerns. And there's political pressure on the Home Office to clarify the rules, improve communication, and address the specific hardships being created for dual nationals in complex situations like the Spain nationality issue and families with children who've never held British passports. Let's quickly recap the critical points from February 25th. Dual British nationals traveling on non-British passports risk being denied boarding to the UK unless they carry a valid British passport or a £589 certificate of entitlement. The change is part of a wider border control overhaul, requiring all travelers to have verified prior permission before boarding. Dual nationals in countries like Spain face additional legal complications around presenting British passports. Children born abroad to British parents without British passports could face serious travel difficulties, and the government's communication about these changes has been widely criticized as inadequate. If you're a dual national or you have family members who are, the action points are clear. Renew any expired British passports urgently. Apply for British passports for children who don't have them. If you're in a legally complex dual nationality situation, take professional advice before traveling. And if you have no choice but to use the certificate of entitlement, start that application process immediately. Because it won't happen overnight, here's what you need to do. Hit that like button if this video just alerted you to a rule change that could have stopped you or someone you know from boarding a flight home. Subscribe because border rules, documentation requirements, and ETA changes are evolving rapidly. Drop a comment, are you a dual national affected by this? And did you know about the February 25th change before watching this video? Share this with every dual national, every British expat living abroad, every family with children born outside the UK. This information could save someone from turning up at an airport and being denied the right to travel to their own country. Next video, I'm breaking down the full ETA system for non-British travelers, which nationalities are now required to have one, how to apply, and the mistakes that are causing applications to be rejected before people even reach the airport. Until then, check your passports, check your children's documentation, and remember, being a British citizen gives you the right to enter the UK, but from February 25th, you need to be able to prove it before you board.